Hi, and welcome to the Fall 2021 Talks at the Academy series. My name is Peter Drake, and I'm the Provost here at the Academy. For those of you who are new to the Academy, we're a graduate school that combines intensive technical training with active critical discourse with a focus on highly skilled, conceptually aware, figurative, and representational art. You can learn more about the Academy by going to our website at nyaa.edu or our Instagram account at New York Academy of Art. Tonight, I am very pleased to welcome our guest artist, Erin M. Riley. Erin received a BFA from Massachusetts College of Art and Design and an MFA from the Tyler School of Art. Erin is represented by P.P.O.W Gallery in New York with a recent solo show in May 2021 entitled The Consensual Reality of Healing Fantasies. Erin is the recipient of a 2021 United States Artists Fellowship Grant and an American Academy of Arts and Letters Art Purchase Prize, and has completed residencies at Yaddo, MacDowell, Dieu Donné Workspace Program, Vermont Studio Center, and the Museum of Art and Design. The Academy is very fortunate that Erin will also be doing in-person studio critiques with our students later this month. But tonight, Erin is joining us from an artist residency at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts in Omaha, Nebraska. So Erin, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You bet. Just to start off, I'm sure you get asked this all the time, but can you give us an idea of how you arrived at weaving and tapestry making?
Yeah, so should I share my screen?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'll show you. Okay. So yeah, so I learned, I didn't really know about weaving, like I came to art school thinking about images and image making, and I really loved sew, and I really loved sort of meticulous material. So I learned to weave at Mass Art, and weaving is everything. Like there are many things you can do with weaving, but I learned about tapestry, which is image making with wool. And a few of the artists that I was learning about were Helena Hernmark, who creates a lot of corporate commissions, but her work is extremely photorealistic and they're huge. And while the imagery wasn't super inspiring, I was like super amazed by what was possible in a medium that I was just learning about. So, and then this is Magdalena Abikanowitz, who weaves with a lot of sisal and various materials, but similarly is making really massive work. So yeah, those are the few, and this is college work. So I was making work using childhood photographs and trying my best to make this technique do what I wanted it to do, which is really hard in the beginning. So I was super simplifying the images and working with the structure of weaving to create details. And yeah, it was something that I really loved, the contemplative nature of, and the sort of challenge and simplicity of it.
Were you originally a painter or a draftsperson? And was your work equally sort of intensely closed form, detail oriented?
Yeah, so I was making a lot of like collage and painting, and it was sort of like cutouts and like, a lot of paper making things. So to create the tapestries, I've sort of like had to create these line drawings and then go from there. So they all exist first as a drawing, which is called a cartoon, and then that is attached to the loom. So it's followed along there.
And do you think as you became more proficient, your particular touch became more important to the work? In other words, is this something, are you a one-man band? have studio assistants? Is it important that your hand be present?
Yeah, so like this piece is in grad school. So in this stage of my work, I was starting to dye the yarn. And so, so for like the sort of chrome metallic aspects of this work, I was dyeing the yarn in the very variegated manner, which is so that the dye doesn't fully saturate in all of the areas, which creates this sort of painterly aspect and like the chrome sort of shiny aspect. So yeah, so I make all my work. I don't have help in the studio. I warp my looms and dye my yarn and do everything myself. So,
and you source your own wool, right?
Yeah, so a lot of the wool, this sort of came out of necessity, but like a lot of the wool I was getting off of eBay in the early or mid 2000s, and it was from rug mills that had gone out of business. So US based rug mills that were selling warehouses full of stock of yarn. And so I was getting this yarn that was moth proofed and fire retardant proofed, and it was super cheap. So I started realizing that there was this surplus from the textiles industry that I could mine, basically.
It's interesting because I think you have such a distinct palette, and it feels like by dyeing it yourself, you have more control over the palette.
Yeah, for sure. Wool is an interesting material to dye because once the sort of fuzziness of it creates this dulling, so there's like in the water, it can look very vibrant, but then once it's dry, there is this fuzziness that allows it to be a little bit duller. And yeah, so I think there's this like trying to achieve color, and I do a lot of mixing. So like I will take yarn apart and put it back together. So the color is more blendable, like paint.
Yeah. When most people think of tapestries, they probably, think of regal or religious settings, or maybe the cloisters and the unicorn tapestries. And your imagery is so at odds with those traditions. And, they address trauma and, self-harm and body consciousness and just, violence and the real world. And I wonder how your iconography how does it work with the technique and with the deliberation, the sort of strategic nature of tapestry?
Yeah. So I think that I became like a tapestry weaver before I realized the sort of history of tapestry. As far as the cloisters were concerned, like that wasn't something that I was looking at when I was making work. I was looking at contemporary art, and I was on the internet, so I was looking at a lot of images, and the way my work has sort of developed has been in this, a lot of old school tapestries are woven side to side. So there's this element of execution where you're weaving an image and you're proficient at the technique. Whereas for me, it's been, I weave from the bottom to the top, and it is like I am building the image, and there is this sort of collaboration with the loom.
It's funny the way you talk about it, and you mentioned a cartoon for, the underlying drawing. It reminds me of fresco. It reminds me of the sort of deliberate, strategic nature of fresco painting, that you really have to know exactly what you're doing. And you sort of set aside in fresco a giornata, like a day's work. Does that feel appropriate?
Yeah, but I can only weave a certain amount in a day. So I don't see the totality of the piece. So I will only sort of see like 6 inches of the work. at a time, and then it'll roll on the loom. And so there is this level of like focusing on the details, like being minimized to a point where you're really like creating this these details that add to a greater piece. So
well, can you talk a little bit about how you source your imagery? Where does it come from, and you know, how has it changed over the years?
Yeah, so I started, as I was showing, like from childhood photographs. And as I was moving away from home, I started to run out of images to base the work on. And so being online and sort of thinking about girlhood and all of addiction and all of these things that were things that I wanted to talk about, but didn't have the actual photographs of, I just started looking online for source imagery, and also like taking pictures of myself. So the work is often grabbing images from the news that relate to my personal life or my family life, and then sort of interdispersing images of me and sort of like things that I'm going through as the work changes. This is a video. Yeah, so this is a video of how the work is made. I have 3 looms at home in Brooklyn, and this loom is 8 feet wide. So the image is underneath, and usually it's a drawing, but this one had an image, and it's woven one color at a time, and it's all done by hand. And yeah, so that's this piece.
You mentioned the meditative quality of this. You know, I find myself thinking, because the imagery is so intense and it seems to deal with the site of trauma, I wonder if you're in such constant contact with that trauma, does it leave you with a feeling of command over the trauma, or, you know, does the meditation sort of ease that?
Yeah, so I think for me, it allows me to take a step back from the work. It allows me to see the bigger picture, but it also allows me to take a step back at the same time when I'm making the work. And then there's this sort of reveal moment at the end when the piece comes off the loom, and I can sort of digest it in a way that's less photorealistic or less aggressive than a photo can be. So, but there are some works that are extremely hard to, like a lot of the work I make about like domestic violence or drug addiction, or even the car crashes, can be incredibly emotional to make, just because of the content. So there is a level of like curating what I'm listening to so that I can work through the piece as a human being laborer. So
well, I would think it would be so intense because you're so deeply immersed. And, you know, I imagine these are labor intensive pieces. So there's, ordinarily people think of, emotionally charged work as being open form painting, gestural or whatever, but this is a totally different way of absorbing yourself into, the intensity of your imagery.
Yeah. I wove a big piece of a bruise, and that was sort of, you concentrate on like the oranges and the greens and the purples of the bruise, whereas when you're actually looking at the piece and sort of trying to consume it, then you can understand like the actual violence of the pieces. This is a piece that's like, I was looking through a lot of domestic violence documents, police documents and police reports. So yeah, this one has mohair. So the stamp is mohair. And so there is this fuzziness to the piece in sort of like allowing that to be a secondary thing. So the piece is all flat woven, but then the stamp has the mohair. So Yeah, I mean, like this piece was incredibly hard to weave technically. And then there's also this added level of this student who's experienced something and it's, you know, simplified to this document that may be just put in a file and never dealt with or thrown away or something. So.
And it feels so, there's something about it that just feels so depersonalizing, you know, just being reduced to text and to a stamp, you know, just seems like an added cruelty somehow. So many of your figures do appear to be faceless. And is that to sort of make it a more general, a more universal statement?
Yeah, so in the beginning, I was thinking a lot about shame and sexuality and sort of anonymizing the, you know, when I was starting to make work, there was a lot of talk about like revenge porn or just sort of like being conscious of online consent or just the what could be done to you if something was found online, you know, like if a nudie pic was found online, how that would impact you versus why was it online in the first place, like who put this private image online. So in the beginning I was making work and I wanted to safeguard these people who were, for me, I felt very connected to because I was taking images like that and I was just as, you know, worried about revenge porn. And I wanted to reveal the sort of activities of normal people who exist as sexual beings in the, you know, early 2000s, 2010s. And for me, it was like sort of making them everybody, you know, and there is just something very delicious about like a face, you know, like the shape of a face and sort of the chin and like to me, I really just love the outline of a face. Yeah. So for me, it was just like wanting to make them a person and not a specific person.
Yeah, like an every person.
Yeah.
Your pieces, they're so beautiful, really. And I'm just curious what function beauty has for you in your work.
Yeah, I think.
I mean, they're disturbing and they're
right. Yeah, like, I mean, like this piece is like a screenshot from the news from O.J. Simpson's. There was tapes from a domestic incident between Nicole and O.J. And so this was released and there was this 911 transcript. And so there's this like 80s blur behind it. And this is like a weaving technique of sort of dying and resist. And so there is this level of order and yeah, the markings are sort of the way that tapestry is woven. And I think there is something to the simplifying of the work and also it being a tapestry that allows the work to be not as violent or not as hard to see or something. So yeah, I don't really think about beauty, but I think it's sort of it is, I don't know that I think about that in many ways.
Maybe it's just the nature of tapestry itself that there's, you know, an obvious commitment to the craft and to, you know, people. I see it and it's almost like stone carving. You see it and you know what goes into it, or at least you have some sense of, you know, the personal commitment that goes into it. And that in my mind resolves itself as a form of beauty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is like a level of craft and a commitment to making the work. Like I very much value a structurally sound tapestry. So like my work has all of the elements that will make my work be a full cloth. Like there aren't slits, and there aren't, you know, the various things that create different weaving structures, or just making the material different. So there is a level of goodness. Like I am good at tapestry, you know, and I really do value that aspect of weaving for myself.
Do you value that in other artists? I think, you know, I mentioned, or in my notes to you, I mentioned that I'd stopped by Alice and Elizabeth Taylor's show at James Cohan, and you just sort of bowled over when you walk in, and your mind kind of just does flip-flops, just thinking about the commitment and just the complexity and just the organizational skill that goes into making those things. They're just fabulous. But I immediately found myself thinking of your work too, that there's just this incredible commitment and, you know, complexity to what you're doing. Although, you know, she refers to her work as, you know, marquetry hybrids, and yours seem to be on a much more purely, you know, tapestry tradition. Do you feel a connection to artists like that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a lot of what our work does is that it sort of, in many ways, like painting doesn't make you think of paint. And I think there is, and unless it is about paint, but I think in many ways, like one of the challenges of making work that is very material based and very process based is that a lot of the time we are first our material and first our process. And so I think I do sort of feel a camaraderie in that, because you're fighting the material and you're fighting the process and the content and sort of wanting to make the work you want to make, but then you're also sort of wanting the viewer to see the work as a whole and not just as a process that's sort of foreign, or revering it extra, you know, like giving it this like a pat on the back because you are using a material or a process that is time consuming or hard, you know.
Right.
And I think there is that battle of, I really love people who are committed to their medium, whether that's painting or anything else. So
well, and I think there's a huge difference between people who are committed to their medium and people who become kind of craft chauvinists, where it's just about the craft. And that can be in anything. That can be in painting, sculpture, drawing, weaving, whatever. And that becomes problematic if the craft is so foregrounded that the ideas behind it don't become or they just become, you know, backburnered.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, like it's important that my work is woven, because it is, you know, it's not, you can't ignore that. But I also think for me, I'm much more invested in talking about things that are often ignored or thrown away. So
yeah. To go back to your image sourcing, I remember reading an interview between Benjamin Buchloh and Gerhard Richter, and Buchloh was trying to make the case that that there was randomness in the image selection that Richter was using, and Richter was like, "No, absolutely not. You know, that I look at thousands of pictures, and I have to go through thousands of pictures before I find the ones that really speak to me. I may not know exactly what they're saying, but that process is not the least bit random." Is that also true for your selection process?
Yes, for sure. I think for me, it's similar. You know, I find images and I look, since the beginning, I've been, you know, you go online and you sort of search, or you're like, I'm continually like watching things, or like this is a screenshot from the TV show Intervention. So, and I was watching it at a moment when one of my sisters was in relapse. And so there was this, this voyeur like allowing myself to watch other people's recovery. And, you know, so I'm existing in this liminal space of being scared to death, basically, and having the image just sort of come. And I think in many ways, it's like, if I wasn't paying attention to to everything that was happening in that moment, I wouldn't be able to relate this reality TV show that has a lot of issues, you know, ethical issues and all of these things. But for me, it's a comforting place to exist when there is turmoil in my family. So yeah, I think I take a lot of self-portraits, and I take a million of them. And there is a level of like finding the right angles and finding, and I create a lot of images. So I, you know, collage images, or, you know, cut and paste things. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like, you know, when you're sourcing material like that, in a sense, part of what you're doing is training your eye. Like you have to be constantly on alert for imagery that could impact you, right? I mean, you're constantly looking, you know, no matter what it is.
Right. Yeah. And this was a combination of, yeah, so I like this, and this is a very simple image, but I really wanted, I had all this blue yarn that a company gave me. And so it's this incredible cashmere blue with this sort of purpley, it was like the most amazing mixtures of blues. So it was a
iridescent.
Right. So there's this combination of like, it's a heathery blue. So a combination of like wanting to use these materials that are being thrown away essentially, and that are incredibly beautiful, and an image that haunted me. So it's a combination of a lot of things that come together.
Yeah. You know, obviously there are images of yours that are very difficult, you know, self-harm imagery and imagery about shame and body consciousness. And I'm wondering how does that affect your audience? You know, you're obviously not making work to please people so much as to engage them.
Yeah, so I have never worked from a level of like, in the beginning, like a lot of people were calling my work erotica because there was this aspect of sexuality, but I'd never related to that term, because for me, sexuality wasn't a place that I existed that was fun. Like for me, a lot of sexuality is pain and shame and trauma and complex issues. There is a lot of pleasure and joy, but for me, like a lot of learning to be a sexual human involved trial and error and existing in spaces that were uncomfortable. So I wanted to show the aspects of, you know, so for me, like an image of me with my butt out has to exist in the same space of me with the self-harm wounds, because they're not separate, you know, so I can't separate those things anymore. And I think in a lot of ways, like people are constantly required to separate the ugly and the sort of unacceptable. And this is a piece like about my great grandmother was murdered in upstate New York. So this is a piece that's like a family thing that's not really talked about, but yeah, so I'm trying to sort of show the stories that people that directly affect people, but that people don't often acknowledge.
Well, and I think it's because there's so much shame. You know, there's shame about illness, there's shame about sexuality, there's shame about identity, there's shame about trauma and pain, and trying to get people to feel like they can, if not embrace their experience with pain and trauma, they can at least develop some kind of command over it.
Right. Yeah, I think what I find is that often people who experience trauma feel like they have to get out of that space, like get out of survivor mode. And so they become almost the secret keepers. And so in order to acknowledge somebody else's pain or someone else's trauma, they have to also acknowledge their own. And there is this level of like wanting to stay healed. And by bringing it back up, you are perceived as unhealed or or, you know, just like not over it. And I think there is this level of like being able to speak about trauma without it being making the other person uncomfortable or making them have to perform, you know. So yeah.
Well, it's like Kristeva, you know, returning to the site of the wound. You know, it's something that it doesn't mean that the wound, you know, isn't there. It's not denial. It just means that you're recognizing its existence.
Right.
You are on a residency, and it seems like you've done a number of residencies over the years. Do you find yourself adapting to the residencies at all? You know, is it, and, you know, in this particular case, there was a loom that's present, but I'm assuming that most places don't just have looms hanging around. So there must be additional hurdles for you.
Right. So I was here in 2012, so I had a pickup truck, and I have a pickup truck still. So I have had that to take looms wherever I needed them. So I've taken them to Vermont and to North Carolina and Boston and Virginia and all over. So weaving, and I have three looms at home, but two that I travel with. And so a small loom or a sort of medium-sized loom. And right before I started working on my solo show, I was at a residency and I brought my small loom. And so I created these sort of sketches, which is not something I had previously done. And, you know, in school, they tell you create samples or like try it first and then create it larger. And I had never done that just because I'm impatient or stubborn or something. And there is something really cool about weaving a small tapestry and then sizing it up. And there's this almost like a street you've driven down before. Like there is this memory of action that almost feels like an old friend. So you're weaving a piece you've already woven, but it's bigger. And so sometimes residencies allow you to try things that you may not have tried bigger, but then you can weave it bigger, easier because you've already woven it. And other times they just sort of like, for me here, I brought some images from like 35mm images that I have had in a box. And so I've been looking at old pictures and sort of allowing myself to combine memory and images and create these sort of like layered collage pieces that there is almost like this permission because you're out of your home studio and you can sort of play. So
yeah,
it's fun.
It's fun. Plus, I think, you know, most residency programs, you're meeting other artists, you know, you're sort of expanding your network of creative people and hearing new ideas. But I wonder, is there anything about being in, I mean, are there certain spaces that when you've been on residencies felt like were more sympathetic to your ambitions?
Well, I think that like MacDowell is up in New Hampshire, and I feel like MacDowell is a very special place because there is so much history there. And so for me, that was like, that's a place where I feel very connected to the trees, and you're sort of in this, I don't know, like a vortex of creativity. So I definitely feel very supported there. And yeah, I think every residency has its benefits and has its what it helps you get through, you know.
Yeah, but I think there are some artists that don't do well in residencies. There's something about just almost like restarting your studio. Like, are the lights right? Is the wall proper? You know, do I do I have all my tools handy? You know, I just, you know, so many people get so used to their own studio practice and the comfort of that, the familiarity of it, that I always find it interesting when people really love the whole, you know, the residency route. You know, it's almost like a path you can follow.
Yeah, I have been off of it. Like, I haven't done a residency in a few years. And so this is the longest I've been away from New York City since I've lived there. And yeah, I think there is something really good about moving. You know, there is this packing up what you think you need and sort of assigning yourself, but then also, you know, being restricted to what you brought. Like, I ran out of green. And so like I could either go buy a lot of green, but I've also sort of just been like, okay, I'm out of green, and the work is going to be less green. So yeah, it's just like, that's frustrating, but it's also like, it is what it is, you know?
Well, it forces you to be creative, right? It forces you to find a new route.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's also one of the things, you know, one of the classes that we offer here, you know, starts with like a very reduced palettes. And sometimes it's just 3 colors. But if you try to make a painting that has both cool and warm temperatures with 3 tubes of paint, it sounds completely impossible, but people get really creative with it. It's actually remarkable what you can do with 3 colors.
Right. Yeah. And I have these leaves that are using this sort of teal, green, blue that I normally wouldn't use for like nature or grass or, you know, plants, but I've used it and it looks great, I think. So we'll see.
Well, this is a little bit off, but I was just curious, were you raised in a rural environment? I mean, are you more of an urban person, or what's your history?
Yeah, I grew up on Cape Cod, so I guess it would be the suburbs, you know, so it's not, you know, neighborhoods, and you could see your neighbors. So it wasn't rural. And I have lived in cities since you know, I lived in Boston and Philly, and then now New York. So I think I am a city person, but I do enjoy trees. I do enjoy nature, and the sort of serenity of being in a space that's old. Like, so there's something very centering and like grounding about being in the forest. So
I remember seeing one of your pieces, I think it was called Dying on the Vine, which seemed like it was a beautiful plant piece, right?
yes, yes.
And do you give yourself that kind of space to be able to just say, no, I'm just doing a beautiful plant piece here?
Yeah, so I went recently, I taught a class at Penland, which is in North Carolina. And so there were all of these plants that I had never really been around. And so I was definitely taking pictures. And yeah, I think there's something beautiful about just nature, which is like the same thing of like weaving the figure, you know, like there's something very beautiful about thighs or a belly, you know, and there's something just very beautiful about flowers and the natural world. So I think I, for one, have to allow myself the space to enjoy work and make work simply for the pleasure of, I guess this is where beauty comes in. And like, I want to talk about the hard parts, but I also want to create work that is beautiful.
Well, the interesting thing too is a piece like that, if it's in the context of an exhibition where there's a broad range of emotional and human experience, that just talks about life, right? It really just talks about all the extremes.
Right. Yeah.
I think one of the other questions I had sent on to you was about, I know you did a residency at the Museum of Art and Design, and some of the shows that were produced there pretty early on, I think in like the early 2000s or something like that, like Pricked, were really amazing. I mean, they just, put craft on an entirely different level. And I was wondering if you were aware of that at the time, or did you research that when you were a resident?
I hadn't seen that show, but I looked it up when you gave me the questions, and I hadn't seen a lot of that work. So yeah, I think it's cool to see, like there's lace pieces that were like the like HIV and various virus images. So those were very cool. So yeah, I think there's something, a lot of fibers is presented that's very acceptable, and so there is this like gruesome side of fibers that's often not shown.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. I really enjoyed speaking with you tonight, and I'm really looking forward to having you at the Academy. One last question, though. I'm just curious whether this is, something that's a requirement of residencies, or if it's just something that you've done. Do you ever offer master classes, or do you ever do demonstrations of your weaving?
I don't. I've never had a residency that, I've had residencies that sort of require outside engagement. So there are open studios, and then often, because I get nervous in crowds, I will be weaving during open studios to allow myself to get through them. So yeah, there is that level of showing and having people engage with the process. But I often don't teach. I know there are people who really love teaching and who make their living teaching. So I try not to take up that space.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's also, in some ways, so rarefied. I think people would, I'm sure, love seeing it done, but really not necessarily getting how it's done or how it's even projected,
Mm-hmm.
But Erin, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and really looking forward to having you at the Academy. And congratulations on your most recent show too. And enjoy the rest of your residency. You've got a couple of weeks left.
Yeah, I'm leaving next week.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Nice meeting you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.